23 years ago today, a future Hall of Famer named Paul Kariya sustained a vicious cross-check to the head during an NHL game. If you're squeamish, you may want to look away, but here's what it looked like.
And he was leaning too. Watch, he has to reach out for the puck. Oh, man! Well, that's twice as bad as I thought it was. That was a cross-check to the chin and the neck. No.
It was Kariya's fourth concussion in 3 years. Remarkably, he came back to play for another decade, but sustained 2 more concussions. Eventually, the headaches and memory loss were simply too much, and he retired in 2011. However, Kariya's career prompted 2 Ontario twin sisters, who were huge hockey fans, to devote their lives to understanding concussions better and to promoting improved awareness, treatment, and prevention. They are known on YouTube as the STEAM Sisters for their videos on science communications. So let's welcome, in the north end of Etobicoke, there are Sandhya and Swapna Mailabathula. That's Sandhya on the left. Sandhya is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in kinesiology and physical education, and Swapna on the right is an MD PhD candidate at the U of T's Faculty of Medicine. Let's also welcome, in San Francisco, La Chigolo, Mexico, Calypso Kenny, and in Scarborough, Ontario, Hugo Fung, both of whom have sustained non-sports-related concussions, which is a huge and overlooked part of the story that we're going to focus on now. And I'm glad to welcome everybody to TVO tonight for this discussion. Sandhya, get us started here. We, of course, all know about sports-related concussions. They get a lot of attention. But what about off the ice or off the field? Let's say at work. How do people typically sustain concussions in the workplace, for example?
That's a great question. Thanks, Steve. So concussions can happen mainly, we see it in sports, in the media, so that's something that stays in our minds, but it can really happen in any context in our lives. So workplace is one place, but also on the road is another massive place, on the playground, or even just at home. And in the workplace, one of the most common causes is slips, trips, and falls.
And there's some other ways that it's very common in the workplace, including being struck by an object, whether that's, installing something above your head, losing grip, and having it strike you in the head, or in some other fashion.
Or even just on the road while in a workplace setting. Or even with things, just people actually striking other people is another common.
So the 4 top ways that it can happen in the workplace.
Okay, and Swapna, you're doing particular research on the elementary and secondary years in schools. How do kids get concussed at school? Obviously on the pitch or on the playing field we understand, but away from there, how does it happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question, too. So, of course, sports represents a lot of concussions that happen in youth. But when we're looking at the younger subset of that population, we're looking at young children, falls is a very big factor. And that actually does come back into play again when we go through the age spectrum and look at older adults again.
And how well, Swapna, do you think teachers are, and for that matter, other administrators at schools, how well are they trained? I mean, everybody can recognize a cut or a split lip or a broken leg, but concussions, that's tougher. Are they well trained enough to notice those and diagnose them if they have to?
That's a very big question. So there's ongoing research happening about this. And I think we can say that compared to several years ago, we see very good progress in terms of education and training available for the different stakeholders. Coaches and teachers and students themselves do have access to training and education in Ontario, thanks to things like Rowan's Law and Policy Program Memorandum 158 in Ontario. We do see some gaps still in terms of how well certain stakeholders are reached. We see time and time again parents can be reached better, and then there's some certain groups like school administrators that perhaps can have more access to education and training more regularly.
And this actually translates to the general population. According to the Canadian government, only 1 in 2 Canadians actually has little or no knowledge of a concussion, so only 50% of the population has some knowledge of a concussion.
And about 25% of the general public in Canada knows how a concussion is treated or managed, so that does leave room for improvement.
Indeed, and then 40% of Canadians only have some knowledge about the tools and resources that are available around concussions.
So we need to increase awareness and access to those resources for sure.
Okay.
So the summary there is that has increased.
Yeah, Sandhya, let me pick up on that right now, because if you don't know you've been concussed, which I gather is happens all the time, what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So concussions themselves are an invisible injury because, as you mentioned, if you can see a cut or a broken bone, that's a lot easier. But with a concussion, it's not very visible, so the onlooker wouldn't necessarily know that somebody had a concussion. So that could mean that the individual, if they're not sure that they had a concussion, might miss out on that acute period right after the injury. That's so important to actually manage it correctly. If you don't do that, risk for more complications further down the line and a longer recovery period, and potentially also a lower quality of life during that period and that longer effects after that as well.
Okay, we've got some real life examples here of people who've been through this, so let's go to Mexico. Calypso, okay, you're in Mexico now, but where are you from originally?
I'm from Toronto, but I was living on Vancouver Island before this.
Okay, and tell us about your concussion history. Where, when, how did you sustain it?
I was volunteering at a horse stables at the time, and I was actually chasing a miniature horse across a field. And I dove to grab the rope that attached to the horse's halter. And when I stood up suddenly, I slammed the back of my head into a wooden beam on a fence. So it sounds like a really silly accident. And in fact, I didn't know I had a concussion. And I kept working for 3 more hours. And it wasn't until I realized I could no longer have conversations with people and I would find myself in the middle of the stable with no idea what to do that I knew there was something seriously wrong.
And how old were you when this happened?
This was 2 years ago, so I would have been 29.
And was there anybody around to help you after it happened?
No, I was just working by myself and I thought, oh, that hurt. I guess I'll have a bruise later.
You thought you'd have a bruised head, but that was it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were having difficulty having a conversation, which is when you first noticed it. Just tell us a bit more detail around that. How were the words coming out, which presumably, I mean, it must have been a bit scary, wasn't it?
It was. It was my first concussion, so I was trying to talk to someone at the horse stables, and I realized that words were coming at me, and I couldn't seem to put together sentences to respond to them. And I didn't quite know what to do or what was happening. And I'm usually a very on top, logical person. So finding myself in the middle of work, just wondering what I was doing was quite frightening. I still didn't know I had a concussion at that point. I took my bicycle and biked home for 20 minutes and thought this will pass in another hour, but it didn't.
Let me just run over to Swapna for a second. Can I assume that when you've sustained a concussion, getting on a bicycle or continuing to work or something like that is probably not the best treatment for a concussion?
That is an excellent assumption. And it's difficult though, because when you don't recognize that you're experiencing concussion, you may just, do exactly what you were doing before, carry on doing your activity, go home, whatever it might be. And that's dangerous because your brain is very vulnerable in that moment and you're open to further injury. And that is something that we really want to avoid. So we see in a lot of the concussion guidelines out there, whether that be in sport or whether that be outside of sport, that removing yourself from activity is immediately is a very important factor so that you can start the recovery process.
Now, Calypso, you mentioned it was your first concussion. Have you had others?
No, thankfully, no. I've been really careful since then. And every time I bang my head, I freak out and worry I'm going to have another because that one was so horrible. But I've been lucky and just one.
Good. Okay, so far so good. Now, at what point in that drama did you actually get treatment and come to understand that you, in fact, had a concussion?
It actually took me a while. I was very stubborn, and I went to my real job the next day on a farm, which has a lot of loud noises and physical activity. And by the end of the day, I realized I was too sick to ride my bicycle home. So I was very lucky to have an understanding boss, and she drove me to the doctor the next morning, and he told me that it was likely I had a concussion. So I didn't start my treatment until at least 24, 48 hours afterwards.
Now, again, I'm going to flip over to Sandhya here for a second. This kind of, I'm just going to tough it through. I'm just going to power through. I'm not going to acknowledge that anything's wrong. How typical is that?
It's actually quite typical, and part of this is because the symptoms that you might experience with a concussion can actually be seen in a wide variety of situations, whether it be another condition or disorder or just a headache. So somebody might just think that they just have a headache for a day or so, and then finally, a little bit later on, realize that they've had a concussion. And as we've mentioned, having that management and that treatment happen acutely immediately after the injury is so important to avoid the longer term effects as much as possible. So that can be quite important and a bit tricky there for people.
Yeah.
And a quick follow-up, Sonia. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's particularly tricky because, as my sister is saying, there's a lot of conditions and disorders that mimic the symptoms. So we can talk about chronic pain, depression, PTSD, developmental disorders like ADHD. There's a lot of similar symptoms. So those symptoms of a concussion are nonspecific, which do make it very tricky for the diagnosis and for recognition by the individual themselves, which is why awareness is so important to figure out, this is a context in which concussion can happen, what you're feeling could be a concussion, and to, play it safe and err on the side of safety.
So let's hone in then with Calypso on how did you actually conclusively know that you'd had a concussion?
The doctor basically told me, he said, you have all the symptoms for a concussion. It sounds like you banged your head really hard. He said there's no test he could give me that says 100% you have a concussion. But he told me I should treat it like a concussion and take 1 week off work and just be at home. Don't listen to a lot of noise. Make sure that I don't have the lights on and just relax.
So that's the treatment. Just basically do nothing for a week.
It was hard, but I'm glad I did.
And did you feel better after the week was over?
I did. I wasn't at 100%, but I went back to work because I was losing my paycheck at that point. So I'm glad I took a week off, and I did start to feel better.
Okay, thank you for that. Hugo, let's go over to you in Scarborough. And again, I'm going to ask you many of these similar questions. Where, when, and how did you sustain your concussion?
So I actually got my concussion at the beginning of my master's, which was in November 2017. And how it happened was that I was driving home because I wanted to go home and work on a presentation that was due 2 days from then. And as I was driving home, the right lane, it was ending, and there's a car that was in my blind spot that almost sideswiped me. And obviously, I just want to go home and work on my presentation. So tried to avoid that accident, but I ended up getting myself into another accident. So rear ended the car in front, and the car in front hit another car.
Yikes. Okay, so what happened? Your head go into the steering wheel, or tell us what happened? How did you get the actual concussion?
So all I remember is, from my car, at least, once you're about to hit something, it starts beeping. And that's all I remember is just beep, 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 and then boom. And then the next thing I know, I got out of the car and just threw up on the sidewalk. So it was definitely a first for that. Never had that experience before, and hope I never have to, and no one else has to. Where
did you get taken after that?
So it was interesting because I didn't even know what a concussion was at that time. I just kept going on, went to the collision center, and then afterwards went home. I didn't feel well, so luckily my partner came and picked me up, and then we went to go eat, but I lost my appetite and actually threw up again after I ate dinner, so did not feel good.
Hugo, you sound like you were charming company for that first 12 hours of time after the concussion.
Yeah, I felt alone. I don't know, I couldn't organize my thoughts. It was crazy.
So at what point do you finally get yourself to a doctor or hospital?
So it wasn't until I think three days after, because the next day I went down. And I remember that TTC ride down to campus was the worst thing of my life. It was just loud noises, lots of light, too many people. And I went in and told my supervisor, my master's supervisor, that I wasn't feeling well. I don't think I should do my presentation, and told him about the car accident. And he was like, I think you have a concussion. You should probably get that checked out. So luckily, I'm part of the faculty of kinesiology, so our lab is right beside our sports medicine clinic. So I went there and talked to the secretary, and she kind of told me this is the procedure you should go to the ER, get it checked out, and also go consult your family doctor. We have a concussion doctor here, so you can check them out too. And it wasn't until I met with them that I understood everything.
Now, I don't want you to infer that this question is being critical, but you waited 3 days before you got any treatment or attention? Why would you wait so long?
because being a type A person in my master's, I just wanted to, get my work done. I had a lot of commitments and things, so just focused on that. I'm like, my health can wait, and I always hear like it might go away, so maybe it's nothing big. And then it wasn't until I guess the symptoms were exacerbated that I realized what a bad state I was in.
And okay, let me go back to Swapna now at this point, and that is, again, when you hear about car accidents, concussions don't necessarily first come to mind. Cuts, scrapes, broken bones, etc. What is it about concussions that we don't apparently seem to want to either recognize or acknowledge that we've sustained one?
Right. Well, I think a lot of that is to do with, you really want to carry on with what you're doing. You want to feel like you're okay. You want to feel like that you can do the activity for your day. I mean, I think with the stories of Calypso and Hugo, we can see that we have people who are very, very passionate about what they do, and they want to continue that. And denial is something that does happen. And I think that's another reason why the awareness and the recognition is very important, so that as soon as something like that does occur, you can think, oh my goodness, that could have been a concussion, because I know what a concussion looks like and I know what that feels like or could feel like, and recognize it in yourself or recognize in someone around you when something like that does happen.
Well, keeping in mind that it's also a very individualized injury, so some of the symptoms that one individual might experience might not be the same as what somebody else might experience. There's a constellation of these types of symptoms that might occur.
But
Right.
also there are lots of other reasons why someone might not want to recognize a concussion or not want to report it. And there is a stigma around having a brain injury. And so that is another factor for sure.
And then in the workplace, there could be reprisals at work, pressure from others, or kind of feeling like they're weaker than other people, or having that sense from other people themselves. So these are all points that people take into consideration when not reporting.
Well, that's an interesting angle. Calypso, let me follow up with you on that. Has there at any point in your, I don't know if you call it this, your post-concussion journey, has there been any point at which you've thought to yourself, I have to deny this because I don't want to be, I don't know, denied promotions or thought of as less than strong by colleagues or my boss or anything like that? Has that been a part of it?
No, not at all. My boss at the time was wonderful, and she was very willing to adjust work for anyone who had an injury. So, for example, part of my job was driving a tractor, and because of the noise, I just felt like I couldn't do that for the next few weeks. So she was fine with that. It was more just the fact of having to miss work, and since my concussion didn't happen at work, not getting any compensation for that, and feeling like I did have this pressure to return to the workspace just so I would get paid again.
Gotcha. And Hugo, how about you? Was there any aspect of stigma associated with this that you worried about?
Yeah, I would say 2 to 3 parts. First, my family. I come from a very traditional family where I guess concussions aren't a thing. So my dad was like, why are you being lazy, staying in a room, lights off, just sleeping all the time? You should get work done. You're in your master's, get it done. So he didn't understand that because there's no physical symptoms, there's actually things going on in my head that I wasn't sure of. And then second part, I have friends who have had concussions, but obviously the duration varies person to person. So they're like, oh, it goes away within a week. Like you're still talking about it, you're being a sissy type thing. But luckily, again, my colleagues at the Faculty of Kinesiology were well aware and well versed in concussions. So they helped me kind of support and motivate me throughout the whole process.
So Hugo, this whole awareness thing, this is something we all need to work on. People are not being malingerers when they have head injuries, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, we heard from Calypso that she basically had to go lie on a couch, no lights, no noise for a week. And after that, she felt somewhat better and able to return to her regular duties. How about for you? What was your treatment?
So, yeah, same thing. Basically, no lights, no TV, no cell phone, lots of sleep. But I'm not gonna lie, I broke those rules. You can only do that for so long, and not want to turn on the news and check out the agenda on TVO. So, yeah, and they told me not to do any exercise to, try to maintain, try not aggravate the symptoms. But actually, it wasn't until I took part in a program called Prime at U of T, where I got to know Sandia better, that I realized the importance of actually doing exercise, although not at such a high intensity to aggravate your symptoms, and the importance of doing it within the early stages of the concussion to kind of help speed the recovery process up.
Well, watching the agenda, I guess, seems like a very reasonable exception to the rule of no television, no activities, or anything like that. But beyond that, I mean, Hugo, did you not know that every time you played a video game or turned on the news or something that you would be setting back your recovery?
You know, I thought it was worth it because for me, again, I was unaware of the whole concussion thing. So I was like, it won't hurt that much, or it's not going to be a lasting effect. And then like 2 days after, you know, everything just hits you like a wall.
Well, the Mila Bethula twins have actually been talking about this for quite a long time, and not just to television audiences or audiences on YouTube. They had a pretty captive audience not too long ago, almost 2 years ago, and we're going to show a clip of that right now. Sheldon, if you would.
The effects of a concussion are not always observable to an onlooker, so it's very much of an invisible injury too. So we know that our brains are quite fragile, and here we have a 3D printed model of a brain, just to kind of show that. And we know that the consistency of the brain, even more so than in this model, is actually quite like that of Jell-O, so that just emphasizes the need to protect it.
Swapna, what were you two doing there testifying at a subcommittee of Parliament on Parliament Hill?
So our journey started 10 years ago, but before we talk about that, we spoke about Jell-O in that example. We have that brain right here.
Same one?
If only. No, we made a new one. Okay. We have a freezer full of brains, Jell-O brains, just in case we need to talk about awareness.
That did sound a little confusing and bizarre for a second there, so thanks for clarifying.
But we do have a whole journey that started about 10 years ago, and we started by, you know, our own interest in hockey, but we very quickly realized that concussions happen in all sorts of arenas of life, including in the workplace and on the road. And that really led to a private members bill that we were able to develop, and our member of parliament at the time, Dr. Kirsty Duncan, sponsored and had its first reading. And since then, we've been doing a lot of advocacy and a lot of policy work and a lot of research on our own, because that's what we do for our own research. And that took us a little farther.
Yeah, so what we were asking for was a National Concussion Awareness Week, a pan-Canadian strategy to address prevention, management, diagnosis, awareness in particular, across the country in all provinces and territories, as well as a Center for Excellence for Concussion Research, but also continuing evaluation on any ongoing policy, and an expert advisory board to help make sure that any policy that was in place could continue to evolve with involving research, because it's a very evolving field. And all jokes aside, having a tool like a Jell-O brain is quite useful to help increase awareness, because it really gives you the sense of how fragile our brains are and why it's so important to protect them. And then one more thing I wanted to add there was it's very interesting about the approaches people take in terms of management, because complete rest used to be sort of almost the gold standard, but that's actually gone now. What we actually advise is to do rest in the period just after your injury, but then you want to have that, as Hugo was mentioning, gradual return to activity and adding some more of that exercise back in, as long as your symptoms are tolerable.
Yeah, so prescribing exercise to the point where you don't trigger symptoms, you don't exacerbate symptoms, but you are avoiding total rest, because we've moved beyond that in the management of concussion.
And it improves mood, increases cerebral blood flow, and can also improve neuroplasticity.
And this is all sorts of things that we talked about in Parliament in 2019 from that clip you just saw, when we were speaking to a committee that was talking about concussions.
Okay, I have one dumb follow-up question and then one, I hope, more intelligent follow-up question. The dumb one is, how do you make a Jell-O brain?
Magic.
So it's just Jell-O water and a bit of evaporated milk.
But it looks like a real brain. You got a special mold or something like that to make it in?
We spent 10 hours. We spent 10 hours carving it. No, we do have a mold.
Okay, I told you that was the dumb question. Okay, now here I hope is the better question, which is, all right, you had a lengthy list of things that you wanted to get out of your appearance on Parliament Hill, a National Concussion Awareness Week, and so on. How much of that checklist, Sandhya, you go first. How much of that checklist did you actually get through?
So after we testified on April Fool's Day of 2019 to government, they had a subcommittee on sports-related concussions in Canada as part of a standing committee on health. They spoke to a bunch of different testifiers. So we had witnesses who were people from the sports field, people who were athletes, people who were in healthcare, researchers, advocates such as ourselves. And then in the end, they created a report. For example, included in that report would be the Expert Advisory Board, the National Concussion Awareness Week, and there were pieces in there that are still continuing to move, but after the pandemic started, I think there was a bit of a stopper on that.
Yeah, it put a damper on a lot of things.
So you, fair to say you didn't get through as much as, Parliament didn't pick up as much of the agenda as you hoped they would, is that fair to say?
Not as much as the agenda, but we're continuing to work on that and moving that forward. Things are, of course, slower during the pandemic, but that is something that's continuing.
I do think, though, that there was a lot of progress from how much effort it took to have that conversation earlier on in that decade, from 2010 to 2014, to the audience that was listening to us and giving us that time to speak our piece about concussions and all the different things we wanted to talk about, awareness, prevention, management, and so on. In 2019, I think we have seen quite a bit of progress, but we do need to continue to carry that conversation forward and translate that conversation into tangible action. So we're going to have to see sustained efforts through and after we deal with the pandemic.
The fact that it was discussed in Parliament was a pretty big deal, because that means that that is putting importance on this issue, which is important as well.
Now let me check in with our two concussion patients again. Calypso, tell us, have you had, to this day, any lingering after effects from the concussion?
No, I was very lucky. I would say because I took the week of rest, after about a month, my symptoms were all gone and I was back to normal.
And you're 100% today?
I'm 100% today.
But a lot more careful around horses, I bet.
Especially miniature horses. They're very stubborn.
Especially miniatures. Okay. Hugo, how about for you? Are you concussion symptom free now?
No, unfortunately not. I'm still working with, my healthcare providers to try to cope with these symptoms and try to mitigate them. And just management. It's all about symptom management at this point.
What are you still feeling?
A lot of stuff. So I'm still having issues, I guess, conveying my thoughts into words and writing. So that's really critical for, I guess, me, especially since I'm doing my PhD now. And then also I have issues with, I guess, head. It's almost like migraine-like symptoms. Anytime I perform any intensive exercises or strain myself, I tend to burn out easily if I work on a task for too long. So I have to pace and do a lot of mitigation strategies around that.
And just confirming, this is 3 years after the car accident?
Yeah, three, I guess almost 3.5. Yeah, it's coming. But I never knew it would last that long. And, now I understand the seriousness of concussions.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is this a fairly depressing prospect that you're dealing with here?
Yeah, definitely. And I always think back to how, I was pre-concussion and compare myself. But what I've learned is that, you got to take everything in strides, and it's not about looking back, more looking forward and how you can improve from there. So these are all kind of, just looking back, and it's all about moving forward.
I get you. We're down to our last minute here, and I just want to ask the Steam sisters one last question, and that is, we have had some progress on this issue. We have Rowan's Law in Ontario right now, which really obligates, a much more attention among young people in particular when they're playing sports, for example, to make sure that concussions are diagnosed and people are aware of them and that precautions are taken. Sid the Kid, Sidney Crosby, got a concussion 10 years ago last month that certainly put a lot of attention onto the issue. I guess I just wonder in our last minute what advice you'd have for people watching this right now. Swapna, why don't you go first?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Thank you. So I think, putting more stock into awareness and recognition is such an important thing. But I would say that prevention is the best cure. We've heard that time and time again. And that is something that really rings true with concussions. And when we're talking about the sporting world, there's lots of things we can do about prevention that we've heard about. But that does apply outside as well. So when we're talking about the workplace, there's lots of things we can do for prevention.
Sandhya,
Absolutely.
last 20 seconds to you.
Thank you. So in the workplace, some of the things that are important to do is make sure that if you can, avoid those risk factors. So clearing spaces, making sure there are not big objects higher up, that sort of thing. But once the concussion does happen, because we can't prevent every single instance, it's important to kind of have that awareness so people know what to expect. One of the big things that is often missed is the psychological effects of a concussion, the depressive symptoms, anxiety, frustration, isolation, and so on. So that's important to note that that's a thing so that people can know to help other people who have a concussion.
I can't thank the four of you enough for coming on to TVO tonight and really helping us better understand these issues. Sandhya and Swapna, Mila Bethula, the PhD candidates at the U of T, Calypso Kenny in Mexico, Hugo Fung in Scarborough. Best wishes, everybody. I guess I normally say stay safe to everybody, but that's usually a reference to COVID. I'm going to say stay safe as in watch your heads, everybody, especially to you, Hugo. We really wish you well with your continued recovery.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.